this is what that kind of swell sounds like. The diving bell was lowered from the ship to the ocean floor. And there's another element of a compression chamber we haven't touched on yet. The way the divers get their light, heat and air when they're in the icy water.
When we leave the diving bell, we're connected to it by what we call the umbilical, and that is literally what it says on the tin. It is your umbilical. It is a lifeline. Not only does it provide you with the breathing gas, which obviously you need to stay alive on the bottom, and that's essentially an infinite supply, providing nothing goes wrong. It also provides you with hot water, which is pumped around your suit to keep you warm. It provides you with electricity to power the camera on your hat and a light on your hat so that you can see what you're doing. We both have one of those which extend out of the diving bell, all of which is fed from a main umbilical which comes from the ship down to the diving bell on the bottom of the sea. Yeah.
So you start work on what is essentially an oil well. Was it all quite straightforward initially?
Yes, it was. It was business as usual, pottering away, doing what was a fairly straightforward job, removing a section of pipe work, which just means moving a bunch of levers and following instructions. And we have the dulcet tones of a dive supervisor telling us, who was Craig on that day, dive supervisor telling us what to do.
Craig, the dive supervisor, or to use his full name.
It's Craig Robert Martin Frederick.
Okay. As the 3 team members were in their diving bell at the bottom of the sea, Craig was on board the ship. But that umbilical cord with the light, the heat, the air also has a microphone and video camera attached to it, which means that Craig, from his seat on the ship, can see everything the divers can see on the ocean floor. So what does that look like from where you are?
Well, I've got 2 monitors and a monitor for the bell, and obviously there's deck monitors, monitors for the rest of the ship, so I can switch around and see what I need to see. I can basically see their 2 hands. I can ask them to show me something like slew left or whatever, so I can just have a look, see what's around them to orientate myself more than anything else.
Initially, it was all pretty routine. Chris and his fellow diver Dave were doing their repair work. It was a day like any other. But then something started to happen on the ship. What was the first technical issue you encountered?
The first indication, we've got 3 lights, just like traffic lights. So the green light tells you that it's normal diving and the ship is holding steady. And then an amber light means there could be an issue. And then a red light, which means they've lost control of the vessel. The dynamic positioning officer, the DPO, on that night, he just said, look, we got an amber light. And just by the way he said it, it occurred to me that this was quite serious.
Craig doesn't sit with the people navigating the ship, the captain, the main officer. They're all in a command centre called the bridge. But Craig is connected to them through a headset, and he could hear alarms going off. He could hear a commotion. This is a recording from the day. So Craig radioed down to Chris and Dave.
My only concern is Diver 1 and Diver 2. So I just told them to drop their tools and get out of the structure, not realising exactly what's going to happen in the next minute or so.
Meanwhile, at the bottom of the sea...
We had no inkling at all until we heard the alarm sounding. That was the first indication we had. But we often hear alarms. They're often testing them. We can sort of hear, we have a continuous feed from dive control, so we can hear everything that's going on. We can hear people in the background, and that in itself doesn't cause panic. But immediately after that, a couple of seconds later, Craig was telling us in no uncertain terms to get ourselves out of this structure, out of this manifold.
Get out of this structure, boys.
And you could just tell from the tone of his voice and the urgency in his voice that this wasn't a routine thing. This was the real deal. It wasn't a drill.
So you tell them to get out of there. They're going back to the bell. What was the next thing that happened after that?
Traditionally, you would get an amber light. We'd get the guys out of the structure and we would monitor it and stand by. But we'd be well clear of everything. And in fact, he rapidly went to a red light, which means that he could not control the ship and we were going to move away from our set position.
And the reason this was significant is because the ship was connected to the compression chamber, which was connected to the diving bell. So therefore, if the ship was moving away, it would drag those things with it.
Absolutely. I mean, the bell, where the divers are temporarily living when they're working on the seabed, is on wires and cables. So it's like a conker, if you want. And that would drift below the ship. And that was the case on this night.
With the ship drifting away, it created problems for the divers.
As we came out of the structure, the diving bell should have been straight in front of us, maybe 20 metres ahead and above. And when we came out, it wasn't. It was we could tell it had gone behind us because our umbilicals, which should have been running nice and straight in front of us, had been wrapped over the top of the manifold we were working at. So, again, we realised something was odd at this point.
I could see the guys going hand over hand on their umbilical, pulling themselves back towards the bell. And I could hear that too, because obviously you start physical exertions, the breathing goes up. So just like wearing headsets anywhere in the world, that's most of the noise you have. When I work, though, I always have one side of the headsets off so I can hear all the rest of the noise that's going on around me, like the deck radios and the bridge crew talking to me, or the remote operated vehicle. The urgency of the ship's bridge crew told me that this might deteriorate.
As we're both climbing, Duncan, who's in the bell, is pulling in David's slack, so he can only do one at a time. So he's pulling Dave's slack in. My slack wasn't being pulled in, so as I get to the top of the structure, I've left the loop effectively behind me. So I've turned to sort of try and rectify that, to tidy it up essentially. But I mean, literally, in straight away, I could see it was caught on this transponder bucket, which was a metal outcrop essentially sticking out from the structure. It had jammed in, and the sort of weight of 8,000 tons of boat was pulling it so tight so quickly that I was completely powerless to do anything about it, really. So that's the point at which I realised I was in serious trouble. Yeah, I knew immediately this was going to be life-threatening.
Stop the diving. Umbilical is stuck. Umbilical is stuck. The one is absolutely stuck.
So you were powerless, but you were still connected at that point to the diving bell. How were people, you could hear how people were reacting. What were they saying in your ears?
They were pretty calm, but they were urgent. They were urging me to get myself back to the bell as quickly as I could. Then I sort of communicated to them that I needed some slack. It was, slack diver 2, slack diver 2.
There's some slack to diver 2, slack 2.
And they were telling me they couldn't give it to me because the umbilical is wound around the rack in the bell, and because it was being pulled so tight, Duncan couldn't free it.
Chris, we cannot give you any slack.
Inside the diving bell, the situation was deteriorating fast. With the ship moving away, it was dragging the diving bell with it. But with Chris attached to the structure on the ocean floor, he was acting like a sort of human anchor. The tension from this meant that his umbilical cord linking him to the diving bell started to pull equipment off the wall.
Chris, you've got to clear that umbilical yourself.
Trying that all the time.
Inside the bell, his third teammate Duncan was aware that this could be catastrophic.
He was actually bending the sort of stainless steel rack off the wall of the diving bell. It was so tight. So he was, in fact, fearing for his own life almost in the bell. It was going to be ripped off the wall and take him down with it. So
Was he telling you that in your ear?
via the diving supervisor, that was being relayed to me. I mean, we're talking about 5, 6, 7 seconds here, probably not long, but enough to know that they couldn't give me anything. Yeah.
The danger, obviously, to the bellman was that they would just pull off and maybe catch him and drag him into the water. So I could see that Duncan was trying to make himself as small as possible on the side of the bell interior.
And then you started to hear this noise from the umbilical cord.
Yeah, there was a really distinct creaking, which is not a good sound to hear. Yeah, it was horrendous.
I could feel the tension from everybody saying, look, it's going tighter and tighter, I can't slack it, it's bar tight, it's starting to fail. There's electricity cables in there, there's air cables in there, gas cables. Obviously they were failing one by one. And you could hear distinct noises that you weren't used to, because snapping an umbilical, you don't hear that every day.
I ran out of gas very quickly. Suddenly it came upon me. I think the gas hose had stretched to the point that it was crimped and I wasn't getting any supply down it. So I then turned to have a knob on the side of our helmets, which opens a supply of emergency gas from what we call our bailout bottles, sort of emergency bottles on the back we carry on our backs. So I had a supply of gas then, but the creaking continued, and then next the communication line, I could hear that sort of a crackling sound, and eventually that sort of snapped. The whole thing parted. Then there was this outrageous shotgun bang.
And when the whole thing parted, obviously that was your connection to your light, your communication. Were you plunged into darkness?
Yeah, instant. It was a flick of a switch. Actually released the tension, so I fell backwards onto the seabed, which was about 10 or 11 metres below me. It was not just complete darkness instantaneously, but complete silence instantaneously. It was strange, yeah. Suddenly you plunge from this world of panic and light to complete silence and darkness.
You mentioned that you had this backup supply of your helium-oxygen mix. How much would that give you? How long did you have?
The maths tell us that I would have had, at that depth, 5 to 6 minutes,
5 to 6
of
minutes.
gas, yeah. That would depend to some extent on how quickly I breathed it down. So, sort of panicked, rapid breathing would use it up faster than being completely calm. When I was sort of on the seabed, I got up and scrambled around a bit, and I had no sense of orientation at all. I didn't know where to go, and I was very, very lucky in that I bumped straight into this structure we'd been working on. I could very easily have wandered off in the other direction and found myself in the middle of nowhere. And I found the hose we'd been using to do this testing, and I managed to climb up to the top. So that probably took 2 or 3 minutes. And it's only really then, when I looked up into the sea above me and expecting to see the diving bell again and saw nothing, just blackness again, that I realised the chances of anybody getting to me in time were slim, because it gives you enough time just to do a little bit of maths. 5 minutes. I've probably used it for 2 or 3. I've only got 2 left here. This is not going to end well at all. Yeah.
And when you had that moment, you thought, I've got 2 minutes, I can't see anyone, I'm alone at the bottom of the North Sea.
Yeah, it was. It calmed very quickly. I think that realisation that hope is lost, because that's certainly how it felt. That I'm powerless, certainly powerless to do anything to help myself or save myself. There was no option. You can't swim to the surface. That's just not on the agenda. That would kill you instantly, for starters. And physically, I didn't have any buoyancy to swim to the surface. So, yeah, when that realisation dawns on you, it definitely has a calming effect. But it's a very sad, depressing moment, really, to find yourself in this completely alien place, lonely essentially. It's dark and lonely down there, and you wonder to yourself, what on earth, how on earth you found yourself in this position, And so it's that sort of rare opportunity to reflect on what felt like your impending death.
And in those 2 minutes, what were you thinking about?
I think you think mostly about people at home. I don't remember thinking too much about myself, or a bit sorry for myself perhaps, but yeah, mostly you think of the damage you're going to do to the people you're leaving behind, the carnage that's going to be left. I imagine my wife, or my wife to be, being told about this, and her having to deal with it, my mother and my father, and it's it's horrible. It's I can remember actually calling out, apologising to her several times, screaming up into the air, I'm so sorry, Morag, I'm so sorry.
The other person on Chris's mind was their third teammate, his former mentor, back in the diving bell.
I was also calling for Duncan, which was a strange thing, I think because he played this sort of father figure role. It would never have been him coming to fetch me anyway, but for some reason I called his name out in some vain hope that he would drop out of nowhere and rescue me,
Were you aware of it becoming more difficult to breathe?
Absolutely. When you're sort of in the last vestiges of helium in the tank, you can definitely feel it get a little bit tighter. It's a little bit harder to suck it down, and that was a moment which took a lot longer to come than I thought it would. I remember it lasting a lot longer than I imagined. We carry a gauge which tells you how much you have, but it was too dark for me to see it, which again was probably a good thing, because that would have been panic-inducing, I suspect, to sort of what was effectively a countdown clock to your death. But when it did come, there was a definite realisation that this was it, and I really hope it doesn't hurt.
Do you remember losing consciousness?
No. When you think about going to sleep last night, you can probably remember getting drowsy and not, counting sheep or whatever it is, but you don't remember that exact moment of slipping into unconsciousness effectively, and it was very much the same. Yeah, so it wasn't an unpleasant finale, if you like, but yeah, no real memory of the very last moment.
Stay with us for part 2 of Outlook to find out what happened to Chris.
This is the BBC World Service, looking at how COVID is changing the working landscape for women in the United States.
We had no idea if we'd survive.
I'm Neda Taufik, and I'll be discovering how some female entrepreneurs have restructured their businesses to adapt to the times.
Fast forward quickly to today, we're very thankful that we were able to survive and actually grow from it.
I'll also be asking if employers should be offering more flexible work arrangements.
The longer we wait to act, the harder it will be to bring these millions of women back into the workforce.
And if the crisis could spark changes in the U.S. economy to foster equal opportunity.
This has really laid bare this tremendous problem at the heart of our economy, which is that women don't have access to childcare, families don't have access to childcare.
The Empty Desk, Women, COVID, and the U.S. economy.
At bbcworldservice.com/documentaries.
Still to come on Outlook, British diver Chris Lemons is alone at the bottom of the North Sea and his supply of air has run out. A rescue team then come across his body.
He wasn't moving around the top of the structure. He was lying on his back and his arms were sort of up at 45 degrees, but like floating. And he was twitching slightly.
When they retrieve him, he's been without air for about 35 minutes. So what happens? Find out after the latest BBC News.
BBC News with Julie Candler. The European Union's drug regulator has concluded that the AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine is safe and effective, and its benefits far outweigh its risks. The EMA found the jab was not associated with a higher overall risk of blood clotting, though it could not definitively rule out a link with a small number of very rare conditions. It said thousands of lives could be saved if vaccination campaigns resume. Italy, Latvia and Lithuania have said they would start administering the vaccine again, but Sweden has said it needs some time to think about the EMA report. The Mexican Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard says the United States has agreed to share coronavirus vaccines with his country. The White House is reported to be considering a plan to loan 4 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine to Mexico and Canada. The drug has not yet been approved for use in the US. The White House says President Biden does not regret calling his Russian counterpart a killer. Earlier, Vladimir Putin responded to Wednesday's accusation by saying that it takes one to know one. Mr. Putin added that the US was a murderous state with a shameful history. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the National Security Advisor Tom Sullivan will meet top Chinese officials in Alaska shortly. American officials say it will be the first chance for frank discussions over trade and human rights. Reports from Libya say that up to 15 bodies have been found handcuffed and dumped in the eastern city of Benghazi. The area is controlled by forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar. World Athletics has allowed the return of Russian track and field athletes competing under a neutral flag to international events, including the Olympic Games. Their number will be limited to 10 and they'll have to meet anti-doping criteria. BBC News.
I'm Emily Webb, and if you've just joined us on Outlook, today we're focusing on 2 people caught in a nightmarish diving disaster. One is a diving supervisor, Craig Frederick. In 2012, he was on a ship overseeing 2 divers who were doing some work on an oil well at the bottom of the North Sea when they lost control of the vessel. The ship was connected to something called a diving bell, an underwater pressurized chamber, and Craig told the divers to go back there.
Get out of the structure, boys.
Yeah, moving the structure now, moving.
both divers began to climb their umbilical cords back to the diving bell. The umbilicals gave them air, heat, communication. But the umbilical of one of the divers, Chris Lemons, then got stuck on a structure on the ocean floor. And as the out-of-control ship drifted away, it dragged the diving bell with it.
Stop the diving. Umbilical is stuck. Umbilical is stuck.
This meant that not only was Chris trapped at the bottom of the sea, he was turned into a human anchor.
Chris, we cannot give you any slack.
I could feel the tension from everybody saying, look, it's going tighter and tighter, I can't slack it, it's starting to fail. There's electricity cables in there, there's air cables in there, gas cables. Obviously they were failing one by one.
Chris, you've got to clear that umbilical yourself.
Time, not all the time.
When it did break, Chris was disconnected from everyone on board and alone on the seafloor.
Not just complete darkness instantaneously, but complete silence instantaneously. It was strange, yeah. Suddenly you plunge from this world of panic and light to complete silence and darkness. The maths tell us that I would have had, at that depth, 5 to 6 minutes of gas, yeah. That would depend to some extent on how quickly I breathed it down, so, sort of panicked, rapid breathing would use it up faster than being completely calm.
As that air disappeared, his hope of being rescued disappeared too.
I imagine my wife, or my wife-to-be, being told about this, and her having to deal with it, my mother and my father, and it's it's horrible. I can remember actually calling out, apologising to her several times, screaming up into the air, I'm so sorry, Morag, I'm so sorry. And
then he blacked out. Back on the ship, and the situation wasn't improving. That's where Craig had been watching everything unfold. You see, Chris had been attached to a camera and a microphone which Craig could monitor. But when the umbilical cord snapped...
all my monitors went dead, so I had a completely different viewpoint than the divers. Normally I have lights and cameras, and I had all that up until the point Chris's umbilical parted.
As he looked at the black screen, Craig knew that the ship wasn't moving towards Chris. It was drifting away, and the crew still hadn't managed to gain control of it. How aware were you of the fact he only had 5 minutes of oxygen on him?
Very aware. I mean, I make a calculation before every project and work out how much gas they've got for the depth they're working at, and the 5 minutes is a little bit lean. It was more between 9 and 10 minutes, but 5 minutes is good enough. It depends on how quickly he breathes. But no, I was acutely aware that the clock was ticking for us to go effect a rescue.
Did you realise, therefore, as you were moving away from him, as so much was happening around you, that the chances of getting to him in time, getting to him before that air supply ran out, that they were pretty slim?
Well, at the time, that we didn't understand what had happened to the vessel, and normally we would regain control of the ship quite quickly, and we would go back to where we were, and then we would be in the vicinity of where Chris was last spotted, if you want, by Dave. So up until, 5 or 7, 8, 10 minutes, I was supremely confident we would just go back and effect a rescue, because it was unheard of not to regain the control of the ship in that length of time. I've never known a ship to be lost control and unable to navigate itself for such a long length of time.
So how long was it until you were able to regain that control?
Maybe 20 minutes. We drifted at maybe 250 meters away from where we were last situated, so it was a little bit of a hole to get back to that first location.
So when they regained the control after 20 minutes, and as you were trying to manoeuvre the ship to get it back towards the site, how were you feeling?
I was under the spotlight, but I wasn't going to relinquish control of the dive to anyone else. It was certainly my responsibility.
Something that they were able to do as they moved back towards the dive site was to send an ROV, a remote-operated vehicle, ahead. It's an underwater device with a camera on it.
The pilot of the ROV, he saw the structure first, and Chris had somehow made it back to the top of the structure. and he was lying prone on top of the structure. And yeah, it was dramatic because it came over the top of the hill, if you want, over the top of the structure, and there he was, exactly where we hoped he would be.
And can you tell me what his body was doing?
He wasn't moving around the top of the structure. He was lying on his back, and his arms were sort of up at 45 degrees, but like floating, and he was twitching slightly.
The footage of Chris taken when he was on top of that oil well is pretty eerie. He was unconscious, alone, and twitching. But even though they could see him, the ship was still about 10 minutes away. How long was it after he had been disconnected that you made it back to the site and Dave was able to dive down to rescue him?
I would say 35 minutes, probably, something like that.
Okay, Dave, you're clear to go.
Dave went from the diving bell to the structure to get Chris. He thought that this was a trip to recover Chris's body, that there was no way he could have possibly survived underwater for so long with no oxygen. He brought him back to the bell where Duncan, their third team member, was waiting. Tell me about the footage of Chris coming back onto the diving bell and Duncan giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation.
He readjusted his body weight, Duncan, in the bell to take his hat off, and the camera in the bell is at the top of the bell looking down like a fisheye. So I couldn't really see what was going on, so I had to take it from Gospel, or from Duncan rather. What are you doing? He says, I'm trying to get his hat off. What's happening now? I got his hat off, he's really blue. And then he gave him 2 rescue breaths, I guess. And then I just waited for the reaction of what was going to happen next.
And when the reaction was that he started breathing, how surprised were you that it was so quick?
Well, I get goosebumps now talking about it and even thinking about it. He just said, look, he's alive, he's breathing. He's actually talking. And it was remarkable. For one, Duncan to say that, and then 2, I saw him, being helped back into the bell and sat down, and it looked like he just had a bit of a rough day, but he was a normal 6-hour dive,
One of the first faces you did see was somebody that you'd actually been calling out for, who was Duncan.
Yeah, his beaming one, which was lovely, yeah. He's a friendly man at the best of times, but we were particularly friendly in that moment. It was really lovely and comforting to see him, yeah.
Because there is this, I don't really know how to describe it, but this completely bizarre moment where Craig calls down to you and he says, are you all right?
I just said, Chris, how you doing? Everything okay? You don't want to make more of a drama out of a situation that's already got enough dramatics in it.
And you just kind of nod and you just say, yeah.
I don't have any massive recollection of that, but it's on camera, so there's no denying it, yeah.
I think he said something like, yeah, I'm okay, I'm cold.
How did you feel physically?
Exhausted. I think I was in shock a bit. I vomited a little bit when I got back. But beyond that, nothing. I was good. So I had a bit of bruising on the inside of my leg from where I'd been trapped against the structure. But fundamentally, I felt absolutely fine, which in itself is, to me, is more miraculous than a survival itself. To go 30, 35 minutes with nothing to breathe, it's as remarkable to me that I survived unscathed, or at least nobody's been brave enough to tell me otherwise.
Because I really want to know that moment when they told you that you had been at the bottom of the ocean for 35 minutes with no oxygen. How did you react?
I don't know that anybody did specifically spell it out to me. I think maybe they just assumed I knew. Certainly in terms of, I think the timings in terms of how long it had been, it was only a few days later because we still had to stay in that chamber for another 4 days after the accident. It was only when we got out and there's a sort of a party of people to meet you and we were taken through and shown some of the footage, I thought, oh my gosh, I was a lucky boy. Yeah.
You were very lucky.
Yeah.
And when he did make it back onto the ship, a very happy crew was waiting.
I think he ended up with a tea cozy on his head as a good luck charm, But it was remarkable to see. I mean, I think by then, we all realized that we had participated in something that might become special.
But obviously, there's one big, huge question. How were you able to survive that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't think I'll ever know is the truth. We have theories. I have theories. I'd always assumed it was the cold. You hear stories of young children or even adults falling into freezing cold water and surviving for long, long periods because everything's shut down essentially and it stretches out the moment of their death, really. That seemed like the obvious reason. But I think we've come to realise that it was as much to do with the gas we carried on our back. So the emergency gas has this higher concentration of oxygen than the normal gas we breathe, and that, along with the pressure, effectively saturated my tissues and my organs, my vital organs, with oxygen, such that they didn't start dying, and they were obviously just enough. So miraculous, but as yet unexplained, I guess.
How long was it after that happened that you saw Morag again?
We had this 4 days of decompression. I, again, naively had said to Morag, I'm fine, don't worry, I'll see you when I get home. But that wasn't good enough, so she quite rightly jumped in the car and drove to Aberdeen. So I think literally 15 minutes after we were released from the chamber, Morag was walking up the gangplank and I met her there, which was a lovely and emotional moment, as you can imagine, yeah.
Because you'd had that period where you thought, I may never see you again.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Period you're never going to see, and all those hopes and dreams we did have for our future weren't going to happen, and that I was going to cause this incredible pain. Yeah, when you talk of a moment of relief, that's probably was more of a moment of relief when I saw her, and sometimes it's the touch of another human being, isn't it, that triggers the switch, perhaps, yeah. So, yeah, it was an emotional moment.
You did get married 6 months later, and in your groom speech, you made a reference to the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation you had got. Can you tell me what you said?
Yeah, it was. Duncan was very kind to kindly came to our wedding. I did invite Dave as well, but he was professional that he is. He was back at work. I just think I said I'd like to say a thank you to one of two men in this room who's given me a decent kiss on the lips. Yeah. One person in the room in here is definitely going to hate this. Probably one of only two men in this room who've given me a decent kiss on the lips. I won't explain the other one to you. And it got a round of applause. Yeah.
It did
standing ovation, in fact. Yeah.
Did it get a standing ovation? I'm glad.
I didn't buy a drink all night. Yeah.
I think you deserve a standing ovation for that.
I think so.
Something that I was surprised by, I imagine other people would be surprised by, is that you went back to work not that long afterwards.
I think it was a case of getting back on the bike a little bit, and if we hadn't gone back, then maybe we never would have. I don't know. We were nervous, but not in a bad way. There was a lot of nervous laughter and so on, but it was strange. I think as soon as we got into the water, the same three, with Duncan, Dave and myself, we all went back together to the same place. Once we were back in the water and back on a job, it's incredible how quickly you forget things and just focus on what you're doing. So there was a lot of Mickey taking, a lot of abuse through my ear, to be honest. I didn't get any at all the sympathy I thought I deserved. It was lovely, actually. I think everybody normalised it that way. We just carried on as normal, and I think that probably was the best way to deal with it. It was a really freak occurrence in terms of the root cause. It's a well-regulated, very safe form of diving, and as strange as that might seem.
Can you still enjoy diving? Do you still enjoy diving?
It's like any job, it's got good days and bad days, but it did before, Some days it's like being a spaceman. You're bound around on the seabed, slightly weightless, and you climb these big climbing frames, slightly weightless. It's great, See the fish living in that chamber. It has elements of the space station about it, and we get our food passed in on little silver trays, and there's pressure differentials, and you're going out into this alien world with a big hat on and your gas supply through an umbilical. I've read out books by astronauts who've spent a year in space, and there were lots of little things as well which they mention which ring very true. So, yeah, it's a flattering comparison, but I suppose there's something in it, yeah.
Chris Lemons and Craig Frederick in 2019. There's a film about the accident called Last Breath, and thanks to Dogwolf for letting us use those recordings. And before we leave you, a reminder that you can access all of the incredible stories we cover here on Outlook on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. One that I'd recommend is an interview with Jerry Foster.
He's an American helicopter pilot who revolutionized modern news reporting in the 1970s. He became so popular, he even got his own theme song.
He's Jerry Potter, king of the wild blue sky.
I was the best-known news guy in the state. We were the first station in the country, I believe in the world, that had a helicopter owned by the TV station, and that just caught on all over the country.
Based in Arizona, he was known for being first on the scene with his TV camera. His reputation was such that emergency services sometimes relied on him to help out with an incident. He told me about a time that happened, when some students got into difficulties when they were out rafting.
And there's one girl stayed in the raft and she was trying to hang on to it. I put a highway patrolman on my skid.
Which means that the highway patrolman was outside the cockpit, hanging from the base of the helicopter.
She had a rope tied around her arm that was also tied to a life preserver. But when she came out of the raft, she went underwater.
The girl was submerged 2 feet below the surface of the river, and Jerry had to think quickly.
The water was moving so fast that I had to get down in front of her, and I had the highway patrolman on my skid. I dunked the belly of the helicopter into the water. He was able to grab her by the arm. We got her up and took her to the shore. She wasn't breathing. We gave her CPR. We were so intent on getting her breathing again.
They were worried it was too late. But then...
She gasped, opened her eyes, and started breathing. I'm going to tell you that was the most spectacular moment of our lives.
The episode is called The King of the Wild Blue Sky. Find it on the Outlook podcast or on our homepage. Look for the Amazing Aviators collection. Outlook will be back over the weekend, so until then, from me, Emily Webb, and the whole team, goodbye.
area within the warehouse. Yet for the team, it felt very real.
After 8 months of just basically living between four walls, very close to your face, you had this huge area that is completely different. It was just the best thing in the world.
After 257 days of simulated space flight, 2 cosmonauts preparing to step out onto the surface of Mars. But as was obvious once they emerged, this was not the red planet itself, but rather a glorified sandpit.
But it was super exciting, and we had some tasks like the ones that you would see, the Apollo astronauts doing, like collecting rocks, collecting soil samples, and they were just looking at us how we would perform those tasks after all that isolation.
They then rejoined the rest of the crew for the 8-month journey back. Psychologists noted that in between the landmark events of the mission, the crew's mood would drop when they realized they still had so long to go.
There were different periods for sure, waves of feeling extremely nice, and then some parts in which you were feeling a little bit moody. I definitely needed both time with people and time on my own. Sometimes I would go to spend some time by myself, reading or something, for half a day away from everyone else, and after a few hours I felt this extreme need to go and see somebody and talk to somebody.
But as the end approached, the level of excitement grew. And after 520 days, almost 18 months on board, in November 2011, the hatch was unlocked and one by one, the crew emerged.
I have never been that excited in my life than on that day. They opened the door and we came out, and there was like a wall of people in front of us waiting for us.
Pale from a lack of sunlight, but smiling, they started to emerge. They had been on one of the strangest space missions of recent years, a trip to nowhere, but simulating a journey to Mars.
We feel really strange because we had not seen other humans for 1.5 years, and at least when I saw the people, they felt like not real, like they were like animatronics or something like that.
It is really, really great to see you all again. Rather overwhelming. On the Mars 500 mission, we have achieved on Earth the longest space voyage ever, so that humankind can one day greet a new dawn on the surface of a distant but reachable planet.
Yeah, it was a very surreal experience, like feeling a different smell, hearing different sounds, seeing your family again. Super exciting. I always remember the first time that I saw the sun, the first time that I saw a dog, the first time that I saw a baby. It was a very special moment.
So what was the first thing that you did then?
So the very first thing that I did that I wanted to do was eating a fast food burger. One of the first things that gave me that sense of freedom,
Of course, these days, many of us have a bit more of an understanding of a life spent in isolation, if only briefly. So what did Diego learn from his 18-month-long lockdown?
You learn so much about yourself. You get to learn things that you always wanted to learn. I learned to draw. I learned a little bit of Russian. And there was this period after the mission that I was like in love with the world. I would see a tree and I would say, wow, how beautiful this tree. It's amazing that it's there. And before, I was always thinking we're individuals that happen to live in this society. But when I came out, I realized we have these very invisible links to the rest of humanity that we cannot do without.
Diego Urbina ending this edition of Witness History with me, Alex Last. For more of our history programmes, just search online for BBC Witness History.
This is the BBC World Service. What challenges have we faced during the COVID-19 pandemic?
It's been one of the biggest news stories of a generation. But how has it affected those who have to report on it? I'm Nuala McGovern, and I'll be speaking to the journalists who have spent every day of the past year reporting on coronavirus.
OS Conversations. Reporting COVID. Sunday at 14 GMT. And there's a full roundup of today's sports news in 30 minutes. Here's Lee James.
Two heavyweights of European football meet at the San Siro. But will AC Milan or Manchester United progress to the quarter-finals of the Europa League? What impact will the French football travel ban have on the crucial Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers?
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 19 hours GMT, welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Alex Ritson. The European Union's drugs regulator gives its verdict on the AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine amid a surge in cases.
This vaccine is safe and effective in preventing COVID-19, and its benefits continue to be far greater than its risks.
A report finds 40 years of widespread child sex abuse in Germany's biggest Roman Catholic diocese.
I think we no longer need any morality in today's church, because the church leaders no longer have any morality.
America's top diplomat urges China to speak to Kim Jong-un about nuclear weapons. 14 days of national mourning after the death of Tanzania's President John Magufuli. And President Putin says it takes one to know one in response to Joe Biden's accusation that he's a killer. You're listening to the BBC World Service live from our studios in London.
Hello, this is Julie Candler with the BBC News. The European Union's drugs regulator has concluded that the AstraZeneca coronavirus vaccine is safe and effective, and its benefits far outweigh its risks. The EMA conducted its review after several EU states suspended use of the vaccine over fears of a link to blood clots. Jenny Hill reports.
After days of confusion and concern as country after country suspended their rollouts of the AstraZeneca jab amid reports of blood clots, the executive director of the European Medicines Agency, Emma Cook, announced that the risk of developing a clot after receiving the vaccine was no higher than normal. Ms. Cook said that investigations would continue and that researchers would focus on potentially aggravating factors such as smoking, the contraceptive pill, or perhaps even gender. Most of those affected were younger women. But she stressed there was still no evidence that any specific group was at higher risk.
The Mexican Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard says the United States has agreed to share coronavirus vaccines with his country, although details are still being finalized. The White House is reported to be considering a plan to loan 4 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, still awaiting regulatory approval, to Mexico and Canada. More details from our America's editor Candice Peart.
US officials say Mexico is expected to receive 2.5 million doses and Canada 1.5. Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has been a vocal critic of unequal access to COVID vaccines and has said it was unfair that some countries have not received any supplies. He's also complained that Mexico has had to import vaccine doses from Europe, even though they're also produced in the United States. For its part, the Biden administration has come under pressure from allies worldwide to share vaccines, particularly those made by AstraZeneca at a facility in the US that has already been authorized for use in other countries.
The White House says President Biden does not regret calling his Russian counterpart a killer. Earlier, Vladimir Putin responded to Wednesday's accusation by saying it takes one to know one. Mr. Putin said the US had a shameful history from slavery to the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in the Second World War. Here's our Moscow correspondent Sarah Rainsford.
The accusation, the Kremlin says, is unprecedented. A US president calling the Russian leader a killer. The foreign ministry here has demanded an explanation, whilst Mr. Putin's spokesman calls the comment a clear sign that President Biden has no intention of repairing relations with Russia. But Vladimir Putin himself appeared to take the comment in his stride. After all, it plays to his main idea, that the West is Russophobic, a hostile force. The Kremlin spokesman told me that relations with the US now are very bad, and they do seem bound to get worse.
World News from the BBC. The first high-level direct talks between the Biden administration and China are getting underway in Alaska. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the National Security Advisor Tom Sullivan are meeting top Chinese officials. The White House says the talks in Anchorage are a first chance for frank discussions on intense disagreements over trade and human rights. Mr. Blinken has called relations with China the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. Mr. Blinken has also called for an immediate withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Ethiopia's northern region of Tigray. He said the Ethiopian government must end the deployment of regional forces in Tigray and increase humanitarian access. The US is providing another $52 million to address the humanitarian crisis. The French Prime Minister has announced a limited month-long lockdown in Paris and 15 other departments. Jean Castex said the measures would not be as strict as in previous lockdowns, claiming it was a third way which would halt the spread of the epidemic while granting people a degree of liberty. Non-essential businesses have been ordered to close and movement outside will be restricted, but schools will stay open and outdoor exercise is permitted. World Athletics is allowing Russian track and field athletes to compete again in international events, including the Olympics. Alex Capstick has more details.
It's been 12 months since Russian track and field athletes were allowed to take part in international competitions. It followed the suspension of their federation because leading officials obstructed an anti-doping investigation. But with the reinstatement process underway, it was agreed that individual competitors could return to action, although not under the Russian flag. A maximum of 10 will be allowed at the Tokyo Olympics, and those selected will have to meet strict anti-doping criteria. Their involvement is also dependent on Russia's Athletics Federation adopting a list of reforms.
BBC News.
You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Alex Ridson. It's been long awaited, the final conclusions of the European Medicines Agency expert committee into a review on whether cases of blood clots are linked to the coronavirus AstraZeneca vaccine. Dr. Sabine Strauss is head of the EMA's Risk Assessment Committee, known as PRAC.
This vaccine is safe and effective in preventing COVID-19, and its benefits continue to be far greater than its risks. PRAC has found no evidence of a quality or a batch issue. PRAC noted that the number of thromboembolic events reported after vaccination is lower than the expected in the general population, and PRAC has concluded that there is no increase in the overall risk of blood clots with this vaccine.
More than a dozen European nations halted the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine because of safety fears. So has the announcement from the EMA been enough to restart inoculations? Our correspondent Jean Mackenzie is in Amsterdam outside the headquarters of the EMA.
Well, look, countries always said that if they got the green light here this afternoon, they would restart vaccinating quickly, and this is as close to a green light as I think that they were going to get. We've already heard that Italy is going to start reusing the vaccine from tomorrow, as also the French Prime Minister has come out and said he will get vaccinated with the AstraZeneca jab himself. A couple of the smaller countries have followed, and I think we're going to see others follow too. The regulator was even asked directly this afternoon whether countries should start reusing the vaccine, and its answer was pretty clear. We have vaccines that are safe, they are preventing deaths, we need to be using them.
But Dr. Sabine Strauss did say there were still some uncertainties.
Yes, I mean, they have not been able to totally rule out that there is any link here, even though they haven't found one. So that is the slight note of caution that we've heard today. And to counteract this, what they have agreed to do, or what they want to do, is to put a warning on the box to make patients and make doctors aware of the risks of these clots, so they can spot the symptoms, so that if people do develop clots after they have the vaccine, they know what they're looking for and there can be an early intervention. Because, as they've said, it's not unusual when you vaccinate this many people, millions and millions of people, that these very rare incidents are going to be reported. Now, we don't know if they're coincidental or they're linked, and therefore it's just about being alert, being aware and spotting these symptoms so they can be managed.
Is this going to be enough to convince people who actually are offered the vaccine? Because we've had reports of people turning up at vaccination centres, being offered AstraZeneca jab and saying no.
Some EU countries do have a problem with this vaccine. There is a hesitancy amongst some people to take it. This stems back to an earlier decision that was made by a number of the member states not to use the vaccine on older patients for a while until there was more evidence available for this age group. And that did create a slight lack of confidence amongst some people about this vaccine. For a time it was seen as an inferior vaccine. This pause hasn't helped that, and countries, I think, do have a lot of work now to do to convince people that this vaccine is safe, it is effective, and they should be taking it.
Jean Mackenzie outside the headquarters of the EMA in Amsterdam. The EMA's decision is the latest development in what's been a troubled vaccination campaign in the European Union. Several EU countries are struggling with a fresh surge in cases, and the pace of immunisations has slowed due to supply problems as well as nervousness among national governments about side effects. With her assessment, here's our Europe editor, Katja Adler.
It's been one misstep after another for the EU and vaccines. There's talk of flawed procurement, slow national rollout and messy vaccine politics when lives are at stake. EU countries blame Brussels. Brussels blames pharmaceutical companies in particular, and all the while COVID continues to spread on mainland Europe. Italy and Germany are now facing a pernicious third wave. Countries in Central and Eastern Europe have some of the highest death rates in the world. So what went wrong? The EU went for an all-for-one and one-for-all approach when buying vaccines to avoid a public display of disunity amongst member states. But one supplier after another has left the EU short of jabs, AstraZeneca above all. The concern about blood clots is the latest in the EU's uneasy relationship with AstraZeneca. In January, Emmanuel Macron declared it quasi-ineffective in people over the age of 65. He later rode back on that, but all this has further undermined confidence amongst populations more vaccine-wary than in the UK. The EU already lags far behind Britain and the US in its rollout overall. The bloc is one of the world's biggest vaccine suppliers, but yesterday the Commission threatened to stop exports to vaccine-producing countries that are ahead in their immunisation rollouts. The EU dream may once have been about promoting an image of vaccine unity. Now, amidst promises of better deliveries from next month, it appears nervous of the future and looking for targets to blame.
Katja Adler. An independent report has catalogued widespread child sexual abuse spanning more than 40 years in Germany's largest Roman Catholic diocese, Cologne. The Archbishop of Cologne, Cardinal Rainer Maria Volki, who commissioned the investigation, had earlier been heavily criticised for suppressing a report on the scandal. Reacting to the report, these victims of abuse said the Church had lost all credibility.
I think we no longer need any morality in today's church because the church leaders no longer have any morality.
I'm disappointed in this entire report presented to us because it does not include any moral ethical evaluation. How is it possible that the Church, which has such high moral standards, simply ignores this? That must now happen.
Let's talk to our correspondent Damien McGuinness in Berlin. Damien, what's in the report?
So this report touches on the cases of hundreds of abuse victims, and most of them boys under the age of 14, and there are hundreds of people accused of abuse in this Cologne diocese. This is right through the 70s and 80s and 90s. It's important to clarify, though, the report doesn't focus on the abuse itself, but how the Church reacted to these allegations. And the chilling conclusion of this report is that high-ranking priests and indeed bishops covered up and protected those accused of abuse. So there are 75 cases have been found in which high-ranking church officials neglected their duties. One of them was the cardinal at the time, Cardinal Meissner, who was a very popular figure within the church. He died in 2017. He's accused of failing to follow up or report cases of abuse, keeping those allegations within the church effectively and keeping that culture of silence, which is so toxic. And that has really shocked people. So this report really has confirmed what a lot of priests and indeed lay people have suspected for years.
So what's the impact likely to be?
Well, it's really part of an ongoing process, really, I think, of what's going on within the German Catholic Church. On the one hand, we're seeing a lot of people leaving the church. That means in Germany, you go to your local priest, you explain to them, you make an appointment with the officials. It means you stop paying church tax. So it's a regulated process. We know that last year, in the first few months of last year, around 6,000 people in this diocese left the church. That's a very high number. And throughout Germany as a whole, people are leaving the church. On the other hand, it's also a process of reform within the church, because what we're seeing is